Robb Stark sat in the Cold War tent, surrounded by maps and the soft glow of lanterns. His face was tired, older than his years, but there was something new in his eyes, hope. Across from him stood Jon Snow, his half-brother, just returned from the wall, now dressed not in black but in stark grey. The war had changed everything. After the death of their father, Ned Stark, the realm fell into chaos. The North declared Robb as king, but he knew something clearly now. He could not win alone. News had reached him of Jon's rise among the Night's Watch, of the battle against the White Walkers, and the strange alliance Jon had formed with wildlings. But most importantly, Robb knew Jon was more than just a brother. He was the missing piece. When they reunited at Moat Cailin, it was not a hug that came first, it was silence. Then a single sentence from Robb, "You should have been king." Jon smiled sadly. "You still are." Together they made a pact. If the South would never see the North as equal, then the North would ride South, not just for revenge, but for change. Robb would lead the Northern Bannermen, and Jon, now free of his vows, would bring the wildlings and a few loyal brothers from the Night's Watch. The alliance was risky. Many lords doubted it. Wildlings and Northmen had never fought together before. But the name Stark carried weight, and the dream of justice pushed them forward. Their goal was simple: take King's Landing, break the Lannister rule, and bring peace to a shattered kingdom. But there was one major obstacle: Daenerys Targaryen. She too was marching toward King's Landing with dragons and armies. Two storms were heading for the capital, and the city didn't know which one would hit first. As they prepared for the march, Jon visited Ghost, his white direwolf, who had stayed with the wildlings in the forest. The bond was still strong between them, and Ghost, as always, stayed silent but loyal. Jon looked out into the cold winds and whispered, "I don't know if we'll win, but I do know. We can't let them rule us anymore." Meanwhile, Robb spoke to his mother, Catelyn, who had grown quieter over the years, hardened by the war and the loss of her husband. She feared for her sons. "You are not just marching to save the North, Robb," she said. "You are marching to decide the fate of all of Westeros." Robb nodded. "I know, and that's why Jon needs to be beside me." They left Moat Cailin with over 20,000 men. From the snow-covered hills came wildlings, riding hard and fast. Tormund Giantsbane led them with a wild grin, his red beard full of snow and pride. "You know," he told Jon, "this is madness. I love it." Their banners flew together, the dire wolf and the watchman's black. Two worlds that were never meant to unite now stood side by side. The people of the Riverlands watched in silence, some afraid, some hopeful. Stories of Stark honor still lived in whispers, and in the capital, Queen Cersei sat on the Iron Throne, sipping wine and laughing in her usual cruel tone. "Let the wolves come," she said. "I'll burn them all." But far away in the Reach, Varys watched the movement of armies and whispered to Tyrion, "When brothers unite, kings fall." The road to King's Landing was long, bloody, and full of ghosts from the past. But for the first time in years, the North was not divided. And the South? It had no idea what was coming. The cold wind followed them, even as they crossed into warmer lands. Snow melted into mud, and the howls of wolves were replaced by the uneasy silence of the Riverlands. Robb Stark and Jon Snow rode at the front of their joined army, their banners flying high, Stark grey, Watch black, and the wildling red of Tormund's clan. It was a strange sight. No one had ever seen such a force, but the war was not just fought with swords. It was fought in minds, hearts, and old wounds. Every village they passed carried fear. Farmers whispered, women hid, and old men stared from doorways. For years they had known war, Lannisters, Boltons, bandits. Now two northern brothers came not just with knights, but with wildlings. The same wildlings who once raided their homes. The same Night's Watch who were sworn not to take sides. In one small village, a boy threw a rock at Tormund's horse. The wildling laughed and dismounted. "Come here, little crow," he said, holding out a rabbit he'd caught. "A gift, since you've got fire in your fingers." The boy hesitated, but took the rabbit. The villagers watched, confused. Jon turned to Robb. "It won't be easy. The South fears the North. They think we're all ghosts and monsters. Robb replied. Good, let them fear us. But fear was only one part of the march. The other part was betrayal. They had spies. Varys had sent word through a secret raven. The Queen knows you're coming. Cersei Lannister had already begun preparing the capital. Wildfire caches were being reopened. The gold cloaks were doubled. Euron Greyjoy's fleet was waiting in Blackwater Bay. But the biggest surprise came from the south, Daenerys Targaryen. She had landed, and she was no longer the gentle breaker of chains. She was angry. Her dragon Rhaegal had been killed during the siege of Dragonstone. Her advisors had betrayed her. Tyrion was imprisoned for freeing Jaime. And now she rode hard toward King's Landing with fire in her heart and Drogon in the sky. Jon didn't know this yet. All he knew was that time was running out. They camped by the ruins of Harrenhal. The old, burned towers stood like broken fingers reaching to the sky. The castle was cursed, they said. But Robb didn't care. He walked the halls at night alone, thinking of his father. Jon joined him one night, carrying 2 mugs of sour northern ale. Do you remember the last time we played with wooden swords? Jon asked, smiling slightly. Robb laughed. You mean when Arya knocked you down with a stick? They shared a quiet moment, one of the few in that war-torn world. But it didn't last. A raven arrived. The message was sealed with wax, plain and unmarked. Jon read it first and his hands froze. It's Sam, he said, voice dry. He's found something. About me, Robb raised an eyebrow. What is it? Jon hesitated. He says, I'm not a Snow. I'm not even a Stark. The silence between them grew heavy. Jon continued, reading aloud. Your name is Aegon Targaryen, son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, the true heir to the Iron Throne. Robb looked at him like he was seeing a ghost. That's not possible. Jon shook his head. It is. Sam found it in the records. Bran saw it in his visions. Robb turned away, staring at the cold stone walls of Harrenhal. His mind raced. If Jon is a Targaryen, he has a stronger claim than any man alive. Stronger than Daenerys. Stronger than me. But Jon spoke again. I don't want the throne, Robb. I never did. You know that, Robb nodded slowly. But others will want you to take it. Men fight over kings more than they fight for them. Jon sighed. We fight together, or we die alone. Robb looked at his brother, his cousin now, with conflicted eyes. But in the end, blood was thicker than politics. We marched together. Still that night, Robb wrote a letter to Catelyn. He never sent it, but in it he said something that haunted him. If Jon is king, what am I? The next day they moved faster. Reports came in. Daenerys had reached the Stormlands and was torching castles that refused her. Cersei had shut the gates of King's Landing. The city was preparing for a siege. Jon stood atop a hill, looking toward the distant smoke of the capital. Too many kings, he whispered, and not enough honor. The tension between the armies grew. Wildlings didn't trust the southern lords. Riverland's soldiers mocked the Night's Watch. Even among Stark bannermen, there were rumors. Why follow Robb when the Dragon Prince walks beside him? But before any of them could speak, ravens flew in from the sky. King's Landing had struck first. Daenerys had arrived, and she had begun her burning. The sky over King's Landing turned black with smoke. Ash fell like snow. The people screamed, not for food, not for justice, but for mercy. And mercy had no place here. Daenerys Targaryen had arrived before anyone expected. Her army came from the sea, from the south, and from the skies. Drogon flew above the Red Keep, his wings wide as death itself. The Iron Fleet, once commanded by Euron Greyjoy, was gone, burned to floating skeletons within hours. She had offered surrender. Once, then she burned the gates. The Golden Company didn't even get to draw their swords. Drogon melted them where they stood. Inside the city, Queen Cersei watched from a tower. She drank wine, her hands trembling, her eyes red. For all her power and plotting, she had never imagined this. A queen with a dragon and nothing left to lose. Jaime was dead. Tyrion was imprisoned. The mountain stood beside her, silent as ever, but even he looked unsure. The city was burning and the wolves hadn't even arrived yet. Far from the smoke, Robb Stark stared at the horizon. Flames rose in the distance, painting the sky orange. The wind carried the smell of burning flesh. "She's already started," he said, clenching his fists. Jon Snow stood beside him, cloak blowing, jaw tight. His heart felt heavy. He had known Daenerys once. She had been kind, strong, gentle with the weak. But now she was something else. A woman betrayed by everyone, who had lost everything and had chosen fire over forgiveness. "She didn't wait," Jon said bitterly. "She didn't give us a chance." Robb turned to him. "And now what, Jon? Do we march into the ashes? Or do we fight her too?" Jon didn't answer. The next day, they broke camp. The army moved faster, now desperate. News had reached them through fleeing villagers. Daenerys had taken the city walls, but the Red Keep still stood. Cersei hadn't surrendered. Thousands were dead. More would die before the sun fell. When they reached the Blackwater, the true horror showed itself. Bodies floated down the river. Children, old men, soldiers, all burned beyond recognition. A small girl lay on the bank, still clutching a charred doll. Jon dismounted and knelt beside her, his hands shaking. He couldn't breathe. Tormund came up behind him. "This your dragon queen?" he asked coldly. "She burns worse than the White Walkers." Jon didn't answer. But the silence said everything. Robb called a war council that night. Lords from the north and the Riverlands sat around a fire, arguing. Some wanted to attack Daenerys immediately. Others said to wait, let her finish Cersei, then deal with her. "She's no better than the Mad King," Lord Umber spat. "Fire and blood, that's all she brings." "She freed slaves," Lord Glover argued. "She broke chains. She melted the chains to their skin." Jon stood and spoke. "This isn't about the throne anymore. It's about saving what's left. They voted to march at dawn, not against King's Landing, but into it, through the ruins, through the blood. Their goal was simple: stop Daenerys. As they approached the city gates, they saw what remained. Streets turned to ash, bones blackened and twisted. Bells had rung hours ago, but the fire never stopped. Civilians hid in basements. Soldiers dropped their weapons and cried. There were no sides anymore, just survivors. Jon entered first, Ghost beside him. His sword, Longclaw, felt heavier than ever. He had fought White Walkers, undead giants, and traitors, but nothing prepared him for this. Then he saw her. Daenerys stood atop the Red Keep's broken steps, her silver hair wild in the wind, Drogon behind her like a mountain of flame and smoke. She wore black armor now, Targaryen red on her chest. Tyrion was in chains at her side, his face bruised, eyes hollow. When he saw Jon, something in him flickered. Hope or regret. Robb arrived next, sword drawn. His face was stone, cold and unreadable. Behind him, Northern bannermen fanned out, tense. Daenerys looked at Jon with eyes that weren't hers anymore. "You came late," she said. Jon stepped forward. "You killed thousands. I freed a kingdom. You destroyed it," Robb spoke. "There was another way." "There was no other way," Daenerys snapped. "They loved their chains. I broke them." Jon tried one last time. "This isn't who you are." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You don't know who I am." The standoff began. Drogon growled, smoke rising from his nostrils. Wildlings reached for their axes. Stark men tightened their grips. Any movement would be the last, and then Tyrion stepped forward, still in chains. "Enough," he said softly. "No more fire, no more thrones. You'll burn the world to save it, Daenerys. But who's left when it's saved?" She looked at him, her eyes wet now. For a moment she faltered. Then a horn blew, not from the city. From the docks, Greyjoy ships had returned. But not for Cersei, not for Daenerys. They flew black sails with no sigil, and from one of those ships stepped Arya Stark, bloodied, scarred, alive. And she was not alone. Beside her stood Sansa Stark, wearing armor for the first time, a dire wolf brooch at her throat. Behind them, Dornish spears, Reach banners, even a few Lannisters, those who had turned. The Third Army had come. Jon looked between Daenerys, Robb, and his sisters. He realized something. This wasn't a battle for a throne. It was the end of the game. The wind howled through the burning ruins of King's Landing as three Stark siblings stood on three different sides of the same war. Robb on one, Arya and Sansa on another. Jon in the middle, Caught between blood and fire, Arya Stark stepped onto the scorched cobblestones with quiet rage in her eyes. Her face was smeared with ash and blood, but her hand never trembled as it gripped her dagger. Sansa stood beside her, her hair tied back, no longer a lady of the North, but a commander. Behind them marched the soldiers of Dawn and the Reach, armies that had turned against the Lannisters and refused to kneel to Daenerys after the burning. They had come not to take the throne, but to stop the madness, and maybe, just maybe, to save whatever was left of Westeros. Jon Snow watched Arya approach. She didn't say a word. She simply stared at Daenerys, at the ashes behind her, at the mountain of bones that used to be children and mothers and shopkeepers. Then Arya finally spoke. "You were supposed to be better than them." Daenerys stood tall, her voice proud, sharp as steel. "I am better. That's why I'm the only one left to lead." Robb's hand tightened around his sword hilt. He had seen enough tyrants to know what came next. They always thought they were the answer. Always, but it was Sansa who stepped forward next. Her voice was calm, but every word felt like a knife. "You want peace, Daenerys. You think peace comes from fire? You turned this city into a graveyard. I ended the war. No, you just started the next one." Tension thickened like fog. Behind Daenerys, Drogon hissed, sensing danger. Jon moved slowly, his hand open, stepping toward her like someone trying to calm a wounded animal. "Dany," he said softly, "look at what we've become. This isn't what Viserys wanted. It's not what Rhaegar wanted. It's not what you wanted." She looked at him, her face softening for just a breath. Then her jaw tightened. "You don't understand. I was born to rule. You were born to break the wheel," Jon replied. "But now you are the wheel." The ground shook slightly. Tension exploded. From the alleyways, a group of Unsullied emerged, armed and ready. From the city walls, Stark archers aimed down. Behind Robb, Tormund and the wildlings stood braced for battle. Behind Arya, Dornish spearmen locked shields. Any small spark now would ignite the final fire. And then the spark came. From someone no one expected. Tyrion Lannister, still in chains, stood between them all. "I've seen kings fall for less than this," he said loudly. "Seen brothers kill each other over chairs. But never have I seen this many good people ready to kill each other to stop one bad queen." Daenerys turned on him. "You betrayed me. I warned you. You freed my enemies. I buried my family." His voice cracked, but he stood tall. "You burned a city, Daenerys. You killed children, mothers, the weak and the loyal. What are we saving now? The Iron Throne? It's not worth a single more drop of blood." She stared at him, and for a heartbeat, everyone held their breath. Then she gave the order. "Dracarys." Drogon inhaled sharply, smoke spilling from his jaws. But before he could breathe fire, Ghost leaped from the shadows, biting into Drogon's wing. The dragon shrieked, rearing back. Jon shouted. Arya dashed forward like a shadow. Chaos exploded. Robb drew his sword. The Unsullied charged. The Dornish spears surged. Drogon took to the sky, screaming in pain. Fire lit the streets once more, but this time it wasn't from orders. It was from panic. Jon tackled Daenerys, dragging her away from the burning steps. "Stop! This doesn't have to end like this." She screamed and clawed at him. "Let me go!" "I am your queen." But Jon's face was broken. Not anymore. Meanwhile, Arya vanished into the smoke. No one saw her, not even Drogon. Robb fought like a wolf possessed, cutting down men who had once fought for Daenerys. Tormund roared beside him, swinging his axe with wild fury. Northern and southern blood spilled together. Sansa took command of the rear, moving civilians to safety, giving orders with calm precision. She had no sword, but every soldier listened when she spoke. It was civil war inside the walls of a city already dead. And above it all, Drogon circled like a shadow bleeding from his wing, screaming into the sky. In the heart of the Red Keep, Jon finally cornered Daenerys. She was bloodied, wild-eyed, pacing like a cornered lioness. Her dream, her destiny crumbled around her. "You were supposed to help us," Jon said, "but you wanted to rule us instead. I gave them freedom. You gave them fire." She looked at him, then stepped forward and rested her hand on his chest. "You're a Targaryen. My blood, my fire. Rule with me." For a moment John's heart cracked. He remembered her kindness, her fire, her strength. But then he remembered the bodies, the smoke, the little girl on the riverbank. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and in the silence that followed, "Ah." Dagger slid between Daenerys's ribs, not John's, Arya's. She appeared from the shadows, like death itself. No words, no hesitation. Daenerys gasped once, then fell into John's arms. Drogon screamed from above. The sky turned black again. The dragon had lost his rider. The war had claimed its queen. And now the throne stood empty once more, while 4 Starks stood in its ashes. But what came next would not be war. It would be judgment. The fire was over. The screams had gone silent. But the smoke still hung in the air, like a curse that wouldn't lift. King's Landing was not a city anymore. It was a graveyard. Jon Snow stood over Daenerys's body, her silver hair darkened with blood. Her final breath had left a kind of stillness that felt too loud. Arya stood beside him, her dagger still red. She didn't look proud. She didn't even look relieved. She just looked tired. "I didn't do it for justice," Arya said finally. "I did it because someone had to." Jon nodded slowly. "I know." Robb entered the broken hall next, his sword still bloodied from the battle outside. His eyes moved from Arya to Jon, and then to Daenerys's lifeless form. "Is it done?" he asked. Jon nodded again, not meeting his brother's eyes, but it wasn't done. Not even close. Outside the Red Keep, the fighting had stopped. The Unsullied had laid down their spears after hearing of Daenerys's death. Grey Worm was found sitting alone near the remains of the throne room, his face stone-cold. He didn't fight. He didn't scream. He just sat there, staring at nothing. Tyrion, still in chains, limped into the hall where the Stark siblings stood. He looked at Daenerys's body and sighed, like a man who had predicted the storm, but couldn't stop it. "She was the last dragon," he said. "Now there's only fire and ashes." Robb looked around the throne room. The Iron Throne itself had melted in the dragon fire. Only a lump of steel remained. The symbol that had cost thousands of lives was nothing now. Just broken metal and wasted blood. "Good," Robb said quietly. "Let it stay melted." They gathered the armies outside what remained of the Red Keep. The War Council was held in the same square where the city's poorest had once begged for bread. Jon stood in front of them, not as a king, not as a Targaryen, not even as a commander, just as a man who had watched too many people die for the same reason: power. Robb, Sansa, Arya, Tyrion, Tormund, Brienne, Samwell Tarly, even Yara Greyjoy. They were all there. The last names left who mattered. The last players in a game that had gone on too long. Sansa spoke first. "The people are scared, starving, angry. They want to know what happens now." Robb said, "The North has bled enough. We marched for justice, not to wear crowns. I will return to Winterfell after this meeting. The North will be free." Yara narrowed her eyes. "If the North is free, so is the Iron Islands." Dorne's prince, quiet until now, added, "Then Dorne will stand alone too. We never bent the knee willingly. We won't start now." Tyrion raised a hand, speaking through a sore throat. "So we break Westeros into pieces? Everyone ruling themselves? Maybe that's better," Arya muttered. But Jon finally spoke, and his voice cut through the wind. "If we keep breaking apart, more war will come. Sooner or later, someone else will rise, and they'll try to take it all again." Sansa looked at him carefully. "Then what do you suggest, Jon?" He took a deep breath. "No king, no queen, no thrones. Just a council of rulers, all lands, all peoples. Each with a voice." Robb frowned. "A democracy?" Jon shook his head. "Not yet. But something better than crowns and fire. Something that gives people a say." Tyrion looked up. "What if the rulers were chosen? Not born, not named by fire or sword, but voted in by the lords of each kingdom?" Everyone went silent. The idea was wild, unnatural, almost laughable, and yet it was better than what they had. Sansa leaned back in her chair. And who would rule first under this council? No one spoke. All eyes went to Jon, but he shook his head. "Not me, never me," Arya smiled slightly. "You'd make a good king." Which is why you shouldn't be one, Tormund chuckled. Then let the North be free, and the rest can figure out their own mess. And so it was decided. The 7 kingdoms would become 6, with the North finally gaining independence. Each region would rule itself, but send one representative to the High Council of Westeros, a ruling table, not a throne. No more crowns. No more dragonfire. Sansa would return to Winterfell and be crowned queen in the North. Robb, too wounded by war and politics, would step aside and act only as northern protector when needed. Arya. No one knew what Arya would do. She never said. That night she vanished from camp, leaving only a note for Jon. I'm going west, where the maps stop. I need to find something that doesn't smell like blood. Jon took it with a sad smile. Tyrion was released and offered a seat on the new council representing the remains of the Westerlands. Zemwell would represent the Reach, Yara the Iron Islands, and Dorne sent their prince to keep peace. Jon refused all titles. He left with Ghost and a few wildlings, heading north beyond the Wall. No one asked why. But some say the true king doesn't need a crown. Just freedom. As for Drogon, he disappeared, flew east carrying Daenerys' body. Some say to Valyria. Others say to die alone. No one knows, but one thing was certain. The Game of Thrones was over, and the world that rose from the ashes was new. Months passed. The smoke faded. The fires stopped. But the memory of war and of what Daenerys did remained in the bones of King's Landing, like a scar that would never heal. The people started returning slowly. Burned homes were rebuilt with stone and silence. Graves were marked with broken swords and torn banners. The Red Keep, now half ruined, was never rebuilt. The Iron Throne, melted and forgotten, lay buried under ash and rubble, and no one ever dug it out. A new era had begun. The High Council of Westeros met for the first time in the Great Hall of Old Town, far from the ashes of the capital. No throne, just a round table, 7 chairs, and voices that all held equal weight. Sansa represented the North, now fully independent. Tyrion sat for the Westerlands, Samwell for the Reach, Yara for the Iron Islands. Dorne's new prince, Meryn, spoke for the South. Gendry, legitimized by old royal documents, spoke for the Riverlands and the Stormlands, a blacksmith turned lord. And Brienne of Tarth, to everyone's surprise, was chosen to speak for the Crownlands, which now belonged to no crown at all. They argued. They disagreed. But they listened. That alone was a kind of miracle. Robb Stark, true to his word, returned to the North quietly. He had led thousands to battle, buried more than he could count, and watched his kingdom win, only to realize he had lost too much of himself to ever rule again. At Winterfell, he walked the halls in silence. He visited his father's tomb, stood under the old god's tree, and sometimes, when no one was watching, he cried. Catelyn Stark watched her son with worry, but she didn't stop him. She had buried a husband, nearly lost all her children, and seen what war did to good men. She knew what healing looked like. It was slow, silent, painful. One evening she found Robb sitting alone near the godswood. "You saved the realm," she said softly. Robb didn't look at her. "Then why does it feel like I failed?" "Because you're still alive," she whispered. "And you remember every name." Sansa's rule in the North began with quiet strength. She opened trade with Dorne, gave land to the wildlings, and ordered every northern banner to offer aid to southern villages still recovering. She did not wear a crown of gold. She wore one of carved weirwood, and the people called her the Red Wolf, but it was Arya's fate that became legend. She was last seen boarding a ship beyond the Sunset Sea. No maps showed where she was going. Some say she discovered new lands. Others believe she never stopped sailing. Children in taverns whispered stories of the faceless captain who wore no sigil and sailed under a white flag with a single red leaf. And then there was Jon Snow. No one saw him leave. No one knew where he went. One day he was at the edge of the North, standing beside Ghost. The next, he was gone, but the free folk told stories. They said he walked into the land of eternal snow and ice, not as a king, not as a soldier, but as one of them. He hunted, he built, he protected. When winter storms came, He fought for them like he did at the wall. Some called him the White Wolf. Others whispered he was something more. A spirit, a legend, a ghost that guarded the true North. He never wrote back. But Samwell kept a seat empty at the council for him, just in case. Tyrion, older now and limping from old wounds, spent his days in the new library of Old Town, built by Sam himself. He wrote books, recorded the truth of what had happened, and left out no names, not even his own sins. One book was titled The Rise and Fall of Dragons, another, The Last War. He never married, never ruled, but he lived long enough to see peace. Years later, a statue was built in the ruins of King's Landing, not of a king or queen, but of a broken sword stuck in the ground. At the base, carved in High Valyrian, it said, "No more thrones, only choices." People came from all over to see it. Some left flowers, others left nothing but silence. And though the lands were still rough, though greed and pride still existed, the world had changed. Children grew up without fear of dragons or tyrants. Lords sat beside commoners at council meetings. Ravaged cities became places of trade, art and healing. The story of the Stark siblings became legend, a queen in the north, ghost in the wild, a sailor of shadows, and a wolf who gave up the crown to end the game. But maybe the greatest truth was this: the realm wasn't saved by kings or dragons or fire. It was saved by those who chose not to rule.